I've been a journalist in Washington since 1995. Despite that, people do actually seem to like me. I guess I've always been interested in the language of how people in this town talk. And one of the questions you probably are asking, or that I get asked all the time, is, are things here really as bad as they seem on the show House of Cards? And I always say no, because for one thing, the body count here is much lower. But for another, Frank Underwood is much more transparently clear in his language and his motives, at least in his asides to the camera, than most politicians are. I mean, no matter what your political beliefs, you probably learned something a long time ago about our nation's public servants, and that is that as much as they like to hear themselves talk, most of them really aren't very good at it. And it really doesn't have to be that way, because after all, who goes into politics? It's often physicians, lawyers, academics, people whose professions demand a certain amount of articulateness. But what happens is that a lot of politicians want to play it safe. They get into office and they say, wait a minute, I have turf to protect. I don't want to tick off the wrong people. And so there's kind of a herd mentality that develops with regards to what they say. Or they're just fuzzy and obfuscatory. And here's one example, and I'm not trying to single out Hillary Clinton just because she's been in the news a lot, but here's an example of Washington speak. She spoke to a group like yours about the Affordable Care Act, and when she talked about repealing the medical device tax, she said, and I quote, "On the tax itself, again, I think we have to look to see what the pluses and minuses are that are embodied in decision about either to remove or alter this particular piece of the act." This came right before she called for more problem solvers. And as politicians are wont to do, she set herself above the partisan debate by saying, I just think we have to get out of the ideological wars that either we can't change anything or we have to change everything and begin to be smart and pragmatic problem solvers again. Okay. There's also way too much, and you'll hear this when you go to the Hill maybe, there's also way too much legislative shorthand that is totally confusing to the average listener. In our book, in the introduction, Jeff Greenfield tells the story of Bob Dole when he was campaigning for president, was asked by a little girl about what he could do about the problem of acid rain. And Dole turned to this girl who was about 9 or 10 years old and said, "That bill's in markup." Another example, I was talking to Missouri Senator Claire McCaskill about this, and she expressed exasperation with the phrase, "Can we get cloture?" which is, of course, the 60-vote threshold needed to get absolutely anything done in the Senate anymore. They can't take a bathroom break now without getting cloture. And she said to me, complaining, she said, all you hear is, "Can we get cloture? Can we get cloture?" I mean, to my constituents, it sounds like it's some kind of erotic act. There are even weasel words for being clear, albeit unintentionally. You'll hear the phrase committing candor, and that's when a politician inadvertently speaks the truth. Even "let me be clear" has taken on a new meaning. When you hear President Obama say this, and it's become his verbal wind-up for just about everything he says, that's his signal of exasperation, that he's not being heard and that he is not getting his point across. Mitt Romney, during his 2012 campaign's variation on that, was, "Let me tell you," his signal that he wasn't making his point. It's important to remember that none of this is new. I mean, people have been complaining about political language for decades. George Orwell, in a famous essay, once wrote that it's designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable. You must be watching House of Cards. And to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. But if anything, it's proliferating now more than ever because politicians really have to want to stay on message during this incessant 24/7 news cycle and the compulsion that they've had to pass judgment on absolutely everything under the sun, whether it's on a cable news show, in a press release, or on Twitter. And this is by no means limited to Washington. Like everything else, it's just more exaggerated here. In our book, we talk about a number of state-specific phrases. Hog-housed in North and South Dakota, spotting in Massachusetts, radiator capping in Idaho. You can read those in the introduction. But I wanted to talk about just what we see, my co-author and I, as the 7 main categories of Washington speak. And first and foremost is what we call the polite knife in the back. I mean, politicians want to be liked, and so even when they stick it to an opponent, they have an incentive to stay positive. And there's no better example of this, I think, than the phrase that gets hauled out probably more than any others in our book as the one that's so transparently wrong, and that is, my good friend. We quote Congressman Gene Green of Texas in our book as saying that when he first came to Washington, the joke we had was, when someone calls you my good friend, look behind you. He said, I try not to say it unless people really actually are my good friends. There's a linguistic cousin of my good friend that former Congressman Martin Frost of Texas clued us into, and that is minimum high regard. If you'll hear, and this is something said by an older generation of members, where they'll say, I hold that member in minimum high regard. Frost translated that for us, and it said, quote, it means, you're an idiot. There's also the word counterproductive, which Strobe Talbot, the head of the Brookings Institution, described as a word we use here in Washington to mean stupid. And lawmakers have found they can get away with almost anything if they preface it with all due respect. It's kind of become the Washington version of the Southern phrase, bless your heart. You'll never, ever hear a politician just turn down an invitation to speak at an event because they don't like the cause or the person involved. They'll say euphemistically, we have a scheduling conflict. And when they get blowback, to use another term in our book, for something controversial, if they commit candor, they'll say, I misspoke, or I used a poor choice of words, or I'm sorry if I offended anyone. If you hear if in an apology, it's never sincere. And they'll often say as a verbal tick, as you know, which means as you should know, and I shouldn't have to remind you. And finally, in this category, there's cordial, which we in the media tend to rely on. Cordial basically means a cordial meeting of John Boehner and President Obama, means a frosty meeting of John Boehner and President Obama. It's sometimes paired with candid to describe a situation in which both sides express their views without resorting to punching each other in the face. And Obama has used these terms a lot, along with the equally meaningless but polite adjective substantive. The second category I want to talk about is avoidance of the L word, at least publicly. It's considered bad form in Washington to call someone a liar, at least to their face, as opposed to in print or on Twitter. Today's political figures use words, and this word was the inspiration for our book. They use the word disingenuous. When a politician calls someone disingenuous, though, they're not just saying that they're lying. They're saying that, politely, I think you're utterly clueless. The third category is what we call boldness and extremis. Bold is a favorite Washington word. It's punchy, it's optimistic sounding, and it's kind of a break with conventional thinking, and it's also very deliberately vague. It's especially popular, we found, in using a tool to search the congressional record in these early months of a legislative session of Congress, when a lot of bills get introduced, and a member is referring to their quote-unquote bold proposal. And we found, interestingly enough, that Democrats use it a lot more often than Republicans. But Republicans do use it a lot, and one Republican who uses it all the time is Scott Walker. You'll remember when he was governor, or when during his first term as governor in 2012, he urged Mitt Romney repeatedly to reboot his campaign and quote unquote go bold. More recently, Walker told ABC News as a rationale for his probable presidential candidacy, people want fresh new leadership with big, bold ideas and the courage to act on it. Walker has said bold so many times that a Wisconsin political blogger finally said in exasperation, you know, bold ideas can be politically shrewd, but usually bold is just a clothes detergent. We're seeing another synonym for bold lately with breathtaking. In everyday life, breathtaking usually describes majestic scenery or an entertainer's show-stopping performance. But in politics, it's just the opposite. It means wrong-headed behavior on an absolutely epic scale. And another likely presidential aspirant, Ted Cruz, uses breathtaking all the time to describe what he sees as Obama's breathtaking pattern of lawlessness. But he also has used it to describe, just last weekend, the level of support for his presidential candidacy, which he described as nothing short of breathtaking. The next category is, and you've heard this one a lot before, is the aggravating adverb. Frankly, has become one of politicians' most popular verbal crutches. It means I'm not going to be like everyone else you've heard. I'm going to tell it like it really is. But it's so overdone that it's lost whatever power it's had. There's a member of Congress, Glenn Thompson, GT, from Pennsylvania, who appeared on the House floor recently and used it no less than 7 times within the first 60 seconds of a speech. But no politician uses this adverb with greater gusto than Newt Gingrich. Comedian Paula Poundstone once observed that the former House Speaker says frankly often enough to make you wonder what he's being when he doesn't declare he's being frank. Another favorite of Gingrich is fundamentally. In 2011, New York Magazine decided to go and look at every single instance in which Gingrich used fundamentally in his career. They started in the present day, and they could only make it back as far as 2007 before the writer said, I had to stop for my own health and sanity. But in that 3.5-year span, he came up with 418 examples, including fundamentally a falsehood, fundamentally alien to American tradition, and the doubly effective, fundamentally dishonest, and fundamentally dangerous. But I don't want to single out Republicans, because across the aisle, there's literally, and Joe Biden. In his 2012 Democratic National Convention speech, he dropped it 9 times alone. When things hung in the balance, I mean literally hung in the balance, and so on and so forth. The next category I want to talk about is pivoting. So much about being a politician is controlling the terms of the debate. That is, talking about the things that you want to talk about without the pesky distractions from people like us in the media. So you'll often hear criticism of a failed candidacy that's summed up with the line, he or she lost control of the narrative. One way to pivot off something is to say, I'm just focused on, this is often used by presidential contenders before they want to announce, as in, I'm just focused on being governor, or I'm just focused on my subcommittee chairmanship. It's one of those maxims that's difficult for anyone that's outside a politician's inner circle to disprove. And of course, it helps to demonstrate said politician's devotion to his or her duties. Another way is a phrase that Obama uses a lot, and that is, we need to have a conversation about this. This is code for just shut up and listen to me. He said this after the Edward Snowden NSA spying revelations. He said this after Colorado and Washington State legalized marijuana, and he said it in countless other instances. And it basically just means everyone settle down and let's just hear what I have to say about this. Another device, and you'll hear this a lot in presidential debates, is the question we should be asking ourselves is, and this is the way for a politician to give a perfunctory answer to the question that was asked, and then talk about what they really wanted to talk about. This is done so often that academics even have invented a phrase for this. It's called the clubhouse turn. My next to last category, excuse me, is what we call the vivid mixed metaphor. Politics draws from a lot of fields, most often sports, for colorful language. One that's become recently popular is throwing shade, which started in the entertainment and sports worlds as a synonym for talking trash, and is now being used on TV all the time, as in Rand Paul has been throwing shade left and right at his 2016 rivals. But we've noticed that a lot of metaphors come from the transportation field. There's train wreck, which is commonly used to describe a completely befouled situation, like the failure to pass spending bills to avoid a shutdown, or the launch of healthcare.gov. And then there's glide path, which technically is the final descent route for a landing plane, but it's been used with increasing frequency to describe the proper outcome for an issue. It evokes a sense of comfort and certainty, and Obama talks about the glide path that we're on to reducing our healthcare spending, or the glide path that we're on to reducing our number of troops overseas. But as Ben Zimmer of the Wall Street Journal observed, when the glide path metaphor gets transferred to economics, it doesn't quite fly. He observed, even if the economy is being steered to a soft landing, it's still going down, right? Wouldn't we want to get that plane moving upwards, or at least staying level? Anyway, I want to end my talk with the last category of Washington speak. And no speech would be complete without talking about the ubiquitous cliche. That cliches are a safe shorthand, especially in Washington. You've all seen the untold references to Hitler and Nazis, and now the more subtle invocation of the Third Reich, Neville Chamberlain. And every scandal, of course, now has gate attached to it. Mistakes were made as fast entering this category. This is the passive voice way for acknowledging a political screw-up while at the same time steering clear of taking total responsibility for it. We in the media, of course, are cliche factories. We use them all the time, and it's not something I'm proud of. We use kabuki theater to symbolize the ritualistic preening of politicians, even though the actual Japanese event, while stylized, is far from empty or meaningless. There's gotcha journalism, which we're hearing a lot lately. This has kind of come to encompass anything that a political candidate considers irrelevant. But my colleague at National Journal, Ron Fournier, notes that so-called gotcha questions can actually elicit interesting responses. He was the Associated Press reporter who asked President Bush at his first joint meeting with Vladimir Putin. He said to Bush, "Can we really trust this man?" And that evoked Bush's famous response, "I've looked into this man's soul." Another couple of cliches, and I'll just give a few more examples, are you're hearing this now on the campaign trail among the presidential candidates. I want to have conversations with citizens, or I want to hear from the people, or I want to do a listening tour. That all implies that, someone hasn't really made up their mind to run, and they just want to know what the people say, because they're, after all, servants of the people. I mean, they've already made up their mind. This is just paying lip service to that idea. You referenced earlier bridge builder. This is increasingly used as someone with the courage to work across the aisle and work on things with a member of the opposite party. It's used commonly, the no one notable exception being Chris Christie, the New Jersey governor, whose association with bridges has an entirely different connotation. You also hear a lot of, I want to operate government like a business. Well, you're all businessmen, or businesswomen. You know that governments do not actually operate like businesses for a whole variety of reasons. And the only poll that counts is on election day. When you hear a candidate say that, you know that they don't have a prayer. One that started when Will Ferrell was playing George Bush on Saturday Night Live is strategery, which has become kind of a winking code word for I really know what I'm doing. And finally, just to use the last example of political speak, irritating political speak, when a public official unexpectedly leaves a job, too often it's because, quote, I want to spend more time with my family. This really does society a disservice. And my friend Laura Vandekam, who's written 2 books on balancing work and family life, observes, presenting demanding job and time with family as opposing forces really contributes to the false choice duality that's become so prevalent in the popular narrative. So I just want to say in conclusion that political mumbo jumbo can be effective. I mean, after all, why else would politicians keep on using it? But I'd like to believe that its charms are starting to wear off in this media-savvy age. But then again, to use one of my own Politico journal cliches, that hope may just be quixotic. So with that, I'd like to invite your questions, and I'd also like to invite you to visit my book's website. It's in the introduction of our book, but if you'd like to write it down, it's dogwhistlebook, all one word, .com. We really want to hear from people who have good suggestions of what your favorite Washington word or your least favorite or most irritating Washington word is. We have a weekly column that we do on this in the Christian Science Monitor, and if you get chosen, we'll cite you and your example in our column. So thank you.